welcome to the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Wall. I'm an RDH and founder of Inspired Hygiene. For over 20 years, we've had the unique opportunity to see what really happens inside thousands of dental hygiene ops and what it takes to create transformational change that impacts the lives of patients, practice owners, and teams. Each season, we'll focus on one powerful topic, breaking it down with practical strategies, real stories, and tools you can use right away. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome back, everyone. I just really want to say thank you for following the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. And as you know, if you have been with us through this season one, we really got right into it. We're hitting the hot topics that are impacting the hygiene profession and impacting dental practices and their hygiene teams right now. And so we're going to do this one a little bit differently. We're going to now talk about hygiene compensation. And we're going to do this in two different episodes. So think of it as a part one, part two. And so what I'm going to do on this episode is we're going to dive into some of the hygiene compensation benchmarks that have been held for a long time in the industry, look at how things are changing right now, what we might look at in the future, and really how to optimize this with this new era of hygiene compensation that we are in. And then on part two, on the next episode, I'm going to have one of our coaches join, and really we'll talk about the pros and cons of the different hygiene compensation models, particularly a more performance-based model rather than an hourly model, and really look at some real-world experience in practices that we have helped transition their hygiene compensation plans and give you some advice on that. So thanks for joining. Let's go ahead and jump into this. And so I want to talk right now and just kind of state the obvious that hygiene compensation has become a very big challenge as practices are making a significant effort to be competitive, to attract hygienists, to keep hygienists. I will say on a weekly basis, we are hearing from a client, a prospective client, somebody reaches out to us on social media and asks us a question about hygiene compensation. And it often goes something like this. I'm really trying hard to hire another hygienist to, fill out our hygiene team. And this particular individual is asking for significantly more than our current hygienist. Our current hygienists are fantastic. We want to retain them. What do we do? And so we give our thoughts on that. And there is an easy answer, right? The easy answer, I'll just tell you, is you really can't hire somebody else coming in. And sometimes that somebody else might have less experience, certainly less experience in the practice, but they might have less experience in hygiene overall, but yet they're asking for a higher rate. So you're really asking for a lot of culture, I'll say culture dust up, if you hire this individual at a higher rate and you don't increase your current hygienist to meet that rate. Now, again, there are factors that play into that. Like how do your current hygienists measure up to what your expectations are for their performance and how they are fulfilling your expectations with regards to culture and being a diagnostic partner and all of those things. So there's no one size fits all with this, but I will say in general, do not be naive if you're a practice owner or an office manager and think that if you hire somebody new in at a higher rate that your existing hygienists will not discover that and it will become a topic of conversation. So just be prepared for that. So that's just an example of what practices are facing right now. This is super common, and they want to be competitive to attract a hygienist. And at the same time, business owners, those of you that are listening, you must also think about the long-term sustainability of the practice, of the business. And there are some really, I will say, hard, fast business concepts that apply to dental practices that many team members are not aware of. So we're going to dive into some of that as it relates to the hygiene department. So why is it getting harder for practices to be competitive with an hourly pay model? Again, we touched on this a bit. Higher wages are the norm now. I would say, as I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, we have to accept things the way that they are. And in this current time frame, hygiene wages are significantly more than they were 5 years ago. And so in order to be competitive, a practice must raise their expectations that they're going to be paying hygienists more. At the same time, practices that are heavily involved in insurance and are in network with a number of plans, many of them have seen a lowering reimbursement rate. So at the same time, expenses of supplies and things overall in a dental business have increased. Insurance reimbursement has in many instances gone down. Now, if you're in a fee-for-service practice and you're able to bill your practice fees, then you have more control over that aspect of the practice. But that is just one of the things that has really become a crunch point for a lot of practices. The other piece that I mentioned is sustainability. So one of the examples, and we're going to use this as a case study in the next episode, part 2 of hygiene compensation, is we worked with a practice many years ago where a dentist bought in and the hygienists were paid at a 50% rate of hygiene production and also doctor exams. And the doctor immediately recognized that this model was not sustainable, that it was not going to be a long-term way that he could compensate the hygiene team and still keep the practice in a healthy financial state. And we'll dig into that more on the next episode, but that's just an example of that sustainability and how it is really sometimes overwhelming for practice owners to feel like, hey, I've got to do the math on this hygiene compensation. I want to hire somebody. I want to hire someone that I feel like is at the same quality of what we're expecting. But I'm afraid if I make this decision and I make this offer, that I'm going to get down the line and recognize that this is we're in a negative cash flow with hygiene, or we're in a negative production or profitability point rather with hygiene. And sometimes you aren't able to see all the facts with the long-term decision like that. The other piece, the other factor, as we've mentioned, is that competitive wage point. Is so many dentists and office managers are nervous about their hygienists jumping ship for a few more dollars an hour. And that does happen, but I want to talk to you about a couple things to look at and ways to communicate to potential team members. And if you are a potential team member, how to look at it from a couple different angles. So one of the things that many hygienists I have found in my experience are not aware of, and it is this hygiene profitability benchmark. So I want to dive into that a bit. So there's a general business concept that you have customers, you bring in revenue to a business, and obviously you're going to have expenses. And your revenue minus all of your expenses typically gives you the profit in general for that practice. And a business, in order to stay in business, needs to be profitable. There must be revenue that is retained in that business in order to reinvest in either growth in the business, in marketing, in hiring additional team members, in profit for the owner. Owners step into a lot of risk when they are opening a dental practice. I would say it is not out of the realm of expectation for every dentist that owns a practice to be in debt, probably at a 7-figure level, depending on the size of their practice, and many of them are at a much higher rate. Now, that being said, the dental practices typically are quite profitable, and they can generate a great wage for the practice owner and for the team members as well. And that's what we're all shooting for, right? Remember that triple win that we always talk about on every episode. So if we think about hygiene as a business within that business, then the same is true for that department, that you're going to have revenue coming in. That is the procedures that the hygienists are completing and the revenue that's generated by that, minus the expenses of the hygiene department, then there should be money left over for profitability. One of the things that a lot of team members don't think about is all of the different pieces of expense that come with the hygiene department. So we break this down into 3 to 1, so that if we think about, let's say the hygiene department brought in $900, then there should be the expenses of the hygiene department. So the supplies, the equipment, all the things that it takes to run the hygiene department in this example should not exceed $300. That's roughly a third of that $900 production rate. Also, if they produce $900, another piece of that pie, another third, is hygiene compensation. And hygiene compensation includes wages. Hygiene compensation also includes benefits. Now, we get a lot of questions from business owners, do the payroll taxes for a hygienist fall into that compensation piece of the pie, or do they fall into the expenses part of the pie? I have consulted with several dental CPAs, and they typically tell me that hygiene payroll taxes fall into the expenses category, right? So now we're looking at a third of that production goes to expenses, a third can go to hygiene compensation, and then a third should be retained in the practice as profit. This is the 3-to-1 hygiene profitability benchmark. This long-held benchmark is based on basic business principles of expenses, revenue in, and profit. This was developed probably decades ago by dental consultants, dental CPAs, and essentially in order for a dental hygiene department to be profitable, it must produce 3 times the compensation. All right, so 3-to-1, you're splitting that pie into 3 parts: expenses, hygiene compensation, and profit. And then in order for a hygiene department to be profitable, that hygiene department is producing at least 3 times that compensation. Now, it's important to note what type of production is that. And I will say in general, that production must be collectible production. So that means that it is not the production that is billed out with practice fees when you are in network and you're writing off a percentage. So let's say that a hygiene visit, the gross production is $150. But yet when it's run through that in-network plan, they're only going to pay $100. So $50 of that production is not collectible. And so that cannot be factored into that hygiene profitability point. In that example, only that $100 is going to be collectible, and that therefore is the net production. So again, net production, collectible production should be 3 times hygiene compensation in order for that hygiene department to reach the first point of profitability. So the question that we get a lot around this is profitable hygiene still possible? So in light of the increased wages that many hygienists are requesting now, in light of the increased expenses and the decrease in hygiene or in insurance reimbursement for hygiene procedures, if you're in a network practice, that question comes up a lot. Is profitable hygiene still possible? And the answer is yes. I mean, there are a lot of ways to increase net production. One way, obviously, is to increase patient flow, increase the number of patients that the hygiene team is seeing. And that is one way that we see some practices increase production. That is often the only way, though, that is explored. And that is also a way that often is met with resistance from the hygiene team because they think, oh my gosh, I'm trying to do everything that I can do. I'm trying to do oral cancer screening, take blood pressure, do a very thorough periodontal evaluation, take radiographs, assist the dentist in teeing up treatment for restorative, and also, by the way, doing the actual procedure that the patient is here for, right? Typically, that's a preventive procedure, an adult prophy or child prophy, or a peri-maintenance procedure. And now we're looking at seeing more patients in the day. And so what that means typically is cutting back on time. So that is not our method of choice for increasing hygiene net production. The other method for that is to increase the services that are being provided for those patients. And let me back up just a second. When I say increasing patient flow, it is not our method of choice when that hygienist is working out of one column with no assistance. However, there is a model, assisted hygiene model, that allows the hygienist to work out of 2 columns with a dedicated assistant that actually can work very well. And you guys have heard us mention this multiple times. If you listen to other podcasts, you've heard us mention this. And I'm going to drop a link in the show notes here so that to send you to a webinar that we did a while back that'll give you a sense of our philosophy around assisted hygiene. So next, let's get to increasing the services that are occurring with those patients that are coming in. It is extremely common, based on my 20 plus years of experience coaching teams across the country, teams of all different sizes in very high-end demographic areas, in rural areas, in urban areas, in all kinds of different situations. It is extremely common that the hygiene team is not delivering a complete level of services that they could be providing. So in other words, it's very common for their periotherapy awareness and their periotherapy percentage to be much lower than what it could be based on what is reasonable, a reasonable amount of periodontal disease in any patient demographic. We often see that practices are really only have one tool in their tool belt when it comes to periodontal disease, which is scaling and root planning. And if that doesn't work, a lot of times they're at this now what dilemma. And what we have today in 2025 and the recording of this podcast is an enormous number of services that can enhance the services that we're already offering, like adult prophies, periodontal maintenance, non-surgical therapy. There are a lot of services that can enhance the patient's clinical outcomes, that can give hygienists other services to add to the patient care stack. And as a result, again, patients are getting a good outcome. We only recommend treatment that is in the patient's best interest, but it also gives the hygiene team more services that help elevate that net production, right? So I wanted to give you all kind of this breakdown of hygiene profitability. What does that mean? And let's wrap this up by talking about how do we get to that point of profitability. And I would say really it is addressing that elevating hygiene services. And the first step, you're going to see this in an upcoming episode, is we're going to talk about your periodontal potential. What is the potential in your practice for identifying and treating periodontal disease in the practice versus maybe what you might identify and refer out, because that is appropriate in some cases as well. We're going to talk as we go forward. You've already heard in one of the previous episodes about hygiene service mix and what are some ideas and thoughts on presenting different things and implementing different services into your hygiene service mix. But this is a huge piece that many practices are missing with regards to elevating their hygiene profitability. And so I love the opportunity to share with dental teams, with hygienists in particular, about this hygiene profitability benchmark, because many hygienists don't know that this is a measurement tool that is being utilized to evaluate the effectiveness of the department, and also to be being used to evaluate the level of compensation that can be provided to the hygienist. So here's what we're going to do on part 2, the next episode, is we're going to talk about the pros and cons of performance-based hygiene compensation. So one of the things that many practice owners are looking at is perhaps it's time to shift out of the traditional, somewhat old-fashioned hourly compensation model, because the hygiene compensation levels are so much higher. We've got to be creative and look at how can we make this a win-win-win. We'll also look at some real life examples of practices that we have helped, and I'm going to bring on one of our coaches who has specifically helped facilitate some of these hygiene compensation model changes and how that can be successful. So stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you so much for being with us, and we can't wait to share more on this topic with you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Inspired Hygiene Podcast. We hope you got a ton of value and some things that you can really take away and implement now. So as always, we invite you, if we can help you in any way to optimize your hygiene department, head on over to inspiredhygiene.com. And as always, stay inspired.